Okay. We think that when you give this power in the hands of the EU, you're likely to get far better decision making, far less of a race to the bottom in terms of corporate tax, and also just better response to crises and policy making overall. That's why we're so proud to propose. I want to start by characterizing what the level of taxation that is set by the EU is likely to be. I think it's likely to be relatively high for a couple of reasons. The first is that the EU can afford to set a relatively high corporate tax level across the EU without a risk of companies leaving the EU in and of itself and headquartering elsewhere. The reason that the EU represents an extremely large market, and it gives preferential treatment to companies that have headquarters or presence within the EU in and of itself. So insofar as that's true, and insofar as the EU is the largest market in the world when it's taken cumulatively, bigger even than the US, the EU basically has sufficient power to, set a relatively high level of tax. But also I would note that the key decision makers who are relevant for making EU-wide decisions, or at least the most powerful countries within the EU, are ones that have relatively high levels of corporate tax. So I'm thinking right now about countries like France and Germany, and these people obviously have more influence in terms of making EU decisions insofar as they're the largest economies within the EU. This would only be happening with their explicit approval and so on. And to an extent, yes, they probably do fear being undercut by potential smaller tax havens like Ireland, Luxembourg, etc. So the tax level is set relatively high. By relatively high, I mean something like 25%, maybe 30%, for example, across the EU. But I don't think the specific number itself matters. So with that said, then, two arguments. Firstly, why does this prevent a race to the bottom in terms of corporate, tax havens and so on? And why is that very good? So obviously status quo is one where there are corporate tax differentials across the EU. And in particular, some countries such as Ireland, for example, set very low levels of corporate tax in order to try and attract firm investment and so on, and try to sell it as a kind of comparative advantage. So companies can gain the benefits of the EU whilst paying a low level of corporate tax. I think, though, that this is an incredibly bad thing, both within the countries that are themselves tax havens and across the EU as a whole. Within the countries that are tax havens, we think this is bad because ultimately the model of development adopted is a really unsustainable one. Essentially, what these companies are doing are just essentially what these countries are doing are just inviting these companies in, allowing them to set up specific headquarters and therefore elevating a small minority of people who then become extremely significant. But also that leads to huge amounts of inequality. It leads to things like rising house prices, for example, because you have this new elite of people coming into the country who don't really care about it at all, but who raise things like house prices because they live in Dublin, etc. So it has a number of deleterious effects on the country itself. But now opposition might say, oh, well, if this is the case, why are these countries still tax havens? Well, the reason is very simple. It's in the interest of the elite in these countries to maintain this level of tax. The reason that they gain direct benefits from it in terms of, the prestige of attracting particular companies, or they get lobbied directly by Apple and so on. And they do things like fear mongering, which show that, which convince the average person that you can't get rid of this tax haven status of the particular country in things like elections. So overall, these tax havens are bad for the country, but that's unchangeable as well in that country. Now you force that to change insofar as you are implementing a corporate tax level, and you solve this at a stroke. You bypass the broken politics that exists in these places, and instead you mean that there's a higher tax level overall. So it's good for that country in of itself. They can pivot towards a more sustainable level of development. And I would note it's unlikely that these companies ultimately engage in the extra additional cost of moving their headquarters away from these places insofar as they've already set them up. But now they pay a fairer level of tax overall, which we think is good. But second of all, across the EU, we think it's best to have one level of corporate tax, because otherwise you don't get a race to the bottom whereby different countries undercut each other to try and ensure that they attract the most number of firms or whatever, and because they are unable to do so anymore because they don't have the level of corporate tax to do it. So that's the first argument. Before I go on to the second argument about why the control of fiscal policy going to the EU is good, I'll take a POI from closing.
You've already undercut your case with your framing. You told us that Germany and France have high levels of corporate tax. Why do you think they are able to do that and aren't subject to a race to the bottom?
Because of the reason, I guess, because they're larger economies, so they can to some extent afford to do so, and also their model is not really dependent upon that, right? The German and French model is dependent upon things like manufacturing and so on, rather than being a tax haven. Okay, second argument about why EU control of this corporate tax is very good. So the framing I want to note here is that the vast majority of firms in the EU, in particular medium and large ones, trade across borders. And these transnational companies and these are obviously also true for TNCs who benefit from corporate tax havens and so on, which means that companies often benefit directly from cross-border facilitations that the EU enables. So they benefit directly from things like common infrastructure, subsidies, EU currency rate stabilization, and etc. And so insofar as that's true and they benefit directly, we think they should probably be taxed by the EU as well. But also, this now allows the EU control over policy making. I would suggest that in general, the EU is a far better decision maker in terms of setting the level of corporate tax than individual countries. It's because they have things like relevant experts who, know a lot about economics, obviously, and who have managed things like monetary policy for a long period of time. It's because it's often a very technocratic institution, which means that they can directly respond to economic phenomena that are occurring rather than being vulnerable to political fluctuations that may happen in a particular country. And that means that has a number of positive impacts in of itself. The first thing is that it enables corporate tax to be set in line with interest rates as well. So status quo is where the EU controls monetary policy and so sets that across the EU, but individual countries are able to set their own corporate tax level. This is extremely harmful because if, for example, there's very high inflation going on, which is true at the moment, and so the EU wants to raise its interest rates, that is less effective insofar as there are countries that have very low levels of tax and so implementing stimulus into the country and therefore enabling inflation as well. When the EU is able to control corporate tax, it's able to manage those crises far better because it can also raise corporate tax at the same time, and corporate tax is a very important lever insofar as companies are the drivers of inflation or economic growth in general. So it's very good in and of itself in terms of responding to problems for the EU to have control over this as a stimulus mechanism or as a contraction mechanism. But also I would note that insofar as the EU has an obligation to create cross-border equity and uplift member nations as a whole, it's far better to equalize tax levels and so ensure that companies can more easily trade across countries as well. At the end of the day, the EU is a best decision maker and they prevent a race to the bottom. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Leader of Opposition, whenever you're ready.
I hope I'm clearly audible, just starting at 20.
Yep, you're audible. By the way, I've started a timer in line with World's policy. You're currently 30 seconds into your minute.
Right. Medhavini going as leader of opposition. Paula, I'll take one from the closing. And I'll ask one myself, please don't mute, setting up my own timer. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. For OG to yield any of its benefit, it has to prove one thing, that this common corporate tax is likely benefiting all of them, which means it takes in consideration the context of every country, the needs of every country, and the niche of every country. And so far they don't go ahead and do that, I'm unsure as how it happens. Also, it's very unstrategic coming from opening government when they say that they are likely going to set it at a higher rate. I think it's an unrealistic situation because you need incentives coming from these corporates to go ahead and invest in your country. Most of the times, these incentives looking like offering lower tax brackets or different tax brackets based on the certain niches, which means at a point of time you have alternative rising economies like Japan, India, things like that. European Union is not the only place where companies want to invest in the first place, which means at a point of time this uniform tax is likely to be high. They're going to move to these other avenues that offer them better situation in the first place. The second we talk about they want to have they want to benefit they talk about race to the race from the bottom from the countries, but the problem is that most of the time these smaller countries are able to differentiate differentiate themselves from like bigger countries like France, Germany within European Union by offering like smaller tax breaks so that they're able to like attract FDI on the very first place. More on that later, but a little extension like on the idea of smaller businesses, right? Insofar, we're going to prove to you that these bigger corporates, firstly, probably don't have incentives to invest in you because they already have alternative avenues. But secondly, also go ahead and like harm a lot of smaller businesses, like in a paradigm where there's development of starters, think like that, because you're disincentivizing them by not offering favorable conditions, by offering like higher tax brackets in the very first place. But then I think it's important to frame generally what these European Union markets look like and why it's likely going to be worse for them. Firstly, notice that European Union is not a very huge economy, which means that even like accumulative, like all of the different economies there, they're still like far behind the US and things like that. But the second we'll talk about is these economies are very, very diverse, which means a certain economy is dependent on, let's say, tourism, the other on handicraft and some on tech and things like that, which means the need of these economies are varied, specific to the context in which they're there. But thirdly, notice most of like the middle bracket economies, like if you let alone Germany and France, things like that, are dependent on a couple of contexts in terms of how their economies function. Firstly, in terms of scalability of like certain industries, like industries that are likely to yield them profit, but also like non-scalable industries that don't yield them that much profit, which means insofar there's differentiation between the kind of industry that exists on the first place, the kind of taxes that you want to impose within these industries are very, very varied. These are varied, secondly, for the reason the idea of context, right? Which means if you probably like see in an international environment when certain tech industry is thriving, let's say AI and things like that, and certain market has enough niche to develop on that further, you probably want to offer lower tax brackets and want to attract far more FDI, which means this context of like booms and busts that happen in international system largely like vary across these European countries, but also vary the kind of profit that you earn via them. But third thing to talk about is in terms of like shocks, right? Like things like COVID. So a lot of like European Union countries that were dependent on tourism were hit hard by COVID, which means they had to go ahead and like adjust their corporate tax accordingly to still have like enough like economic incentives within these countries, which means at a point of time there's so much diversification. I'm unsure as to why these multiple considerations would even be taken into account while filing in this corporate tax. But it's also important to note that if their idea is that you need a central policies because things like inflation, political climate, etc., happen and you want to deal with them better, notice that these in and of itself are very, very different. So the way that like Germany responded to Russia not supplying oil was starkly different from other countries who had avenues of non-renewable sources, which means even impacts of inflation or fluctuations within international like environment are really, really contextualized to where this country is located in the very first place, which means smaller countries become the most vulnerable actor within this thing. Two argumentation from our side why most European Union countries are like to suffer, but secondly, why this causes more instability in European Union. So firstly, why are most countries within European Union likely going to suffer? Let's talk about firstly is on the idea of like weaker nation at large. Insofar I've proven to you the diversity like within these economies, notice how do these smaller economies attract FDI and attract economic growth. Most of the times when they don't have, let's say, things that bigger economies has like infrastructure or supply chains or skilled labor or stability of governance, these are the things that largely go ahead and attract FDI for bigger companies. Insofar smaller countries don't have these selling points, their only USP becomes probably adjusting the tax bracket to seem like a more attractive field for investment in the very first place, which means most of the FDIs are centered around the USP of lower tax rate, which means if you impose a common tax rate, which OG claims to be very high, CG cannot claim otherwise, you're probably going to harm these smaller, poorer countries a lot more, simply because these smaller countries have no way to attract FDI in the first place. And FDI is important within these countries for economic growth, insofar they're insufficient to take this economic growth on their own in an international system. The impact of this argumentation are a few. Firstly, you create a larger divide between the EU countries because the bigger countries were able to attract FDI, still do that in the system. If you have a corporate tax, it's beneficial to them because it reduces their burden. So they're likely to be still economically stronger and attract a lot of FDI and take economic growth. It's more on the weaker nations who probably are in a disadvantage now. But secondly, we talk about in terms of monopolization of certain businesses over these bigger countries, because if OG's impact is want to make the competition more fairer, it's going to get worse simply because bigger countries are better able to monetize on this common tax bracket as opposed to the smaller countries. But thirdly, it just makes EU seems like an unfavorable option for investment by investors at large, because investors invest insofar there's certain degree of differentiation and the niche monopolization of certain industries. If you don't provide them with that, there's less likely going to be any investment. Closing POI.
You yourself mentioned in your framing that different countries have different niches. So even if Croatia now has to raise its taxes, we still have tourism that will attract the tourism industry.
But if Croatia is probably trying to make a certain industry seem more attractive by having lower tax bracket, you make them rise their tax bracket. So they're losing their competitive advantage over that certain industry that they've had it so far, right? Which is bad because Croatia is a small economy that probably thrives on that very thing. The second thing I want to talk about is instability within EU. Sovereignty note, right? Most economic policies are tailored in a manner where you go ahead and maximize your own potential and own national profits, which means you want to have certain degree of flexibility. We believe at a point of time you impose like common taxes, there are a couple of problems. Firstly, state loses its capacity to go ahead and do this. Why is state the best actor? It caters to its people, that like sort of electoral incentives. It wants to personally cater to the needs of its citizens, which it cannot do anymore because there's a common tax. But secondly, you lose a lot of political leverage that you have in an international system, because the way that you economically thrive is also contingent on how much political leverage you have at international system. You don't give state any chance to go ahead and form this political leverage in the very first place, which means at a point of time, these countries are gonna there are a couple of scenarios that can happen as an impact. Firstly, either there's tension because you want to probably leave EU and there's like benefits to EU that you lose upon simply because this corporate tax are harming your economy to that extent. But secondly, even if you don't want to leave EU in the paradigm, you're less likely to use things like legal frameworks or other protective measures and not benefit the economy in the very first place. For these reasons,
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and remind all speakers to please keep their speeches under 7 minutes 15 seconds, because after 7 minutes we stop writing. Yeah, Deputy Prime Minister, whenever you're ready.
I'm just getting a timer.
Yes, you sound a little bit like you're underwater.
That's bad. Do I sound like I'm underwater now?
No, your sound's better now.
Okay, I just need to speak up. Cool. Here eyes verbally, please, because I'm using a split screen. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm not being funny, but we know OO's lost the top half of this debate when they tell you that the EU is a small market. I'm not sure what world they're in, but let's just drop a couple of facts here as a point of framing. And this is framing as to why the rate is likely to be high, stuff that Aniket has already said, but stuff clearly that they need to respond to. Number one, the EU has a tremendous amount of power as a collective bloc for 3 reasons. 1, it is the world's largest trading bloc. 2, it is the world's largest trader of manufactured goods and services, I believe. And 3, I'm pretty sure it's the world's largest trading partner for like over 75 countries, like almost half the world have the EU combined as its largest trading partner. It is beggars belief that TNCs who operate globally, therefore, will not A, want to be incorporated somewhere within the EU, or at least have some sufficient headquarters there, but B, also not neglect the EU market. I would note just empirically, maybe the average reasonable voter reads some news, that then you would understand why the EU is a global leader in regulation across the world, because it is that coordinated action which has allowed the EU to be able to be more demanding in the kinds of regulations it wants. That is why the EU has been a leader on things like online safety and like things like privacy. That is why the EU always seems to be able to go further in its obligations to its firms in terms of green sustainability targets. That is why the EU, just empirically, average reasonable voter would know, are more liberal than other parts of the world in terms of the policies for which they advocate and the regulations they put onto companies. The reason is because they have the power to do so, but that power comes from coordination. I'm going to talk about why this policy uniquely solves the problem of the lack of coordination on their side of the house. The second reason, though, is will. I would note that the EU already has a blacklist for non-EU countries that are considered tax havens, places like Bermuda that are used to avoid paying tax to EU member states. I would note that being a tax haven is potentially worse if you are an EU member state. And the reasons are obvious and twofold. The first is that you are taking money away from other EU states, because insofar as a TNC incorporates itself somewhere within the EU, and there are, say, a limited number of TNCs, there are only a handful of countries that can use this as a realistic method for growth. Not only, like, this is why you only see countries like Luxembourg Luxembourg or countries like Ireland or countries like Estonia having utilized this method, but not every single country in the EU. Not only does this undercut the importance of any of OO's analysis about state power or about like stopping a growth path for countries, because we're only talking about a small number of countries, but it maximizes our benefits of why this is unfair, because only a small number of countries get to disproportionately benefit from tax avoidance, which takes money out of state budgets of other countries within the EU. This is why, for example, we're always told there's not a magic money tree here in the UK, because if you set your corporate tax rate too high, the firms are just going to go to Ireland. So if we want to talk about state power and opening opposition, they need to explain why every other country in the EU that didn't have the first mover advantage to have become the incorporated tax haven should suffer in terms of worse government revenues, because there is a lack of coordination. Coordination in this motion is key, and this is what we have proven, because you are stronger when you act together. When you act apart, as Aniket has said, you actually screw over every other individual country apart from the minority who get to benefit. Secondly, I want to interrogate the idea that these countries are far worse off on their side of the house. Even though they're small in number and their welfare shouldn't be the determinant in the debate, I want to engage with this. Number one, Aniket already gives you reasons as to why these countries are probably not in a perfect state as a result of this unsustainable method of growth. I would note, for example, the massive housing crisis that I know that many people in this room have felt in Dublin as a result of the financialization of the Irish economy. That is going to have long-term productivity impacts on the Irish economy at the point at which people cannot afford to go to certain universities, cannot afford to live too close to certain parts of the city where they need to work, and are just generally less productive, and therefore the economy has to become more and more reliant on this financialized element, on this low taxation in order to support itself. So if it is true that these countries are going to have a tough time weaning themselves off these, like the structure, I would note there will come a point where they'll have to do that, because it is tangibly impacting all of the other ways in which countries can be successful. So yes, you might have low taxation, but there's no point in having low taxation if you don't have a sufficiently educated workforce who can get to where they need to go, or if you have massive service gaps within your like lower skilled industries, because the poorer people in society cannot afford to live anywhere and service those who are benefiting from the financialized economy. It is unclear to me why that is preferential to maybe a decade of having to retransform your economy, and potentially a decade of having to repivot to things that actually add value and are less likely to cause rampant inequality in your society, insofar as only a small number of people can work for those TNCs, only a small number of people can be in those tech villas, but everybody loses out from having a low taxation rate, because everybody is unable to be able to access increased public services that often fill the gaps for the most in need. The final thing I want to do in this speech then is explain why coordination is uniquely harmed on their side, why we solve that, and why that's the most important thing in the debate. But before that, I would like to take a POI from closing opposition.
Yeah, given that there is an incentive for race to the bottom to happen on either side of the house, regardless of corporate tax, what things do you think countries will trade off to attract companies into it? Will it be like workers' rights, other forms of tax? What's it going to be?
Well, number one, as I've already said, the coordination that we think is so important in the EU means that there are often common standards for things like workers' rights. So there's only a limited scope of ways to degrade things in that regard. We think this is one of the big issues that the EU has, and one of the big ways in which they haven't coordinated policy, and that they need to do that to get further equity. But secondly, I would note that we, as per our framing, there are a small number of countries who have been in a race to the bottom, which are harming every other country, because every other country is cognizant of those countries. So the vast majority of countries have public will for taxation to be relatively high, because people don't like TNCs and people want to have good public services, but their countries' governments have to be constantly cognizant of that, and have to be constantly cognizant of the fact that they could go to these small number of tax havens. So I think you just misunderstand the argument, if I'm being honest. Let's talk about coordination. I want to explain why coordination is important. I think it's important for two big reasons. One, coordinated action is how the EU has been able to derive its power externally and be that regulatory hub, be that like place that everybody has to defer to. And I would note that member states benefit from this, whether it's better trade deals, or whether it is like just having being able to implement the standards that they want in their optimal societies, which like Slovakia, for example, couldn't do alone, but which the EU as a coordinated bloc can. Secondly, I would note that coordination creates the homogeneity of standards and regulations within the EU, which makes the EU so easy to do business within and makes it attractive. Member states benefit from that coordination. It is unclear why a small number of member states should be able to defer from that coordination principle, therefore, to harm everybody else. Very proud to propose as a result.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech. Deputy Leader of Opposition, whenever you're ready.
Yep, starting shortly.
Just let you know you're 30 seconds into your minute.
Yep, yep.
Your minute is up. Please start speaking.
Yeah, hi. Pratham going as Deputy Leader of Opposition. I hope I'm clearly audible.
Yep, you're audible.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. I'll engage with like the broad idea that came at Deputy Prime Minister about how if you have low taxation, then you probably do not have enough money to probably educate your workforce or probably like create policies for your people and probably provide better healthcare, etc. The problem with this is that the comparative on their side is that you have high tax rate uniformly across all countries. The problem is insofar as you do not prove the incentives or the entry point that these companies have to entering these smaller countries that do not have any of the advantages that the bigger countries have, the advantages being probably established infrastructure, better supply chains, skilled labor, etc. They don't prove ever an incentive structure for these companies to go for these smaller countries that A, do not have all of these benefits, but B, also do not have low tax rates that might help the company save money. Because of which, the problem on their side of the house is that even if they have high tax rate, and high tax rate means the governments have more money, they never prove why companies would have an incentive to invest in the first place, or why companies would have at least an incentive to enter these countries. Because of which, we feel like they do not have any comparative as to why these smaller countries become better. I think on opening opposition, we are at least able to prove to you that providing low tax rates makes you appear like a country that can be good investment wise because companies have ability to save money, but also how these low tax rates are not something that are permanent, right? These are an entry point to invite companies. We feel like gradually over time, once these companies have outstanding operations in these countries, once they have investment costs attached in terms of like they have established factories, they have established supply chains, they have established accommodation for their employees, they have built complexes. We feel like it becomes more and more difficult for these companies to shift out of these countries now. And it is then that you can increase the prices or increase the tax rates for these companies. We feel like then not only have you created an entry point for these companies to enter these countries, but also you can gradually build the amount of money that you need for other activities within your country, that is providing affirmative action or other important expenses that the government might have. We feel like then why would these companies find it difficult to shift out of these countries once they have outstanding operations? We feel like it takes not only a lot of money because you have already invested a lot, but it also takes a lot of time to build infrastructure from ground up in a different country. We feel like this time or the lapse period that comes in between is largely going to be very detrimental for this company, because in that lapse period, this company is not producing as much. This company's operations have halted, because of which the outstanding products that they have in the market have reduced, because of which the amount of money that they can accrue has reduced, and thus the profit margins that these companies have at large have reduced. Because of which we have proven to you a mechanism that at least providing an entry point can ensure long-term benefits, and at least it provides an incentive for companies to invest in these countries in the first place. We feel like then the point of race to the bottom does not stand, because absent this point of race to the bottom, we feel like disproportionately certain countries have their own advantages. These bigger countries in EU, for example, Germany, France, already have advantages that would invite these companies. We feel like then it becomes exclusively important as to which side of the house in this debate is able to provide exclusive benefits or at least a USP to these smaller countries to invite this form of investment. We feel like then it becomes extremely important that these these countries with lower economy are able to distinguish themselves from these bigger countries in at least some avenue or in at least some area. And why does that become important? We feel like once these countries are able to reduce their tax rates, they have more and more foreign investment. Foreign investment is good because having more money with you has multiple benefits that come alongside it. Not only do you have like more money to invest in affirmative action policies, but also you have more ability to subsidize businesses and businesses that are on the rise. We feel like on a comparative, on their side of the house, the government does not have this money in the first place to invest in startups that might be coming up. So for example, startups like AI, startups like based that are based on the cloud, or for example, even subsidizing semiconductor manufacturing, just like Taiwan did. We feel like for that, government needs to have enough money to subsidize the raw materials and to subsidize these resources. This money comes only from FDI and influx of money in the economy. This is an exclusive benefit that's only present on opening opposition. Then, why is it important to increase FDI for these companies? When these countries have more money, these countries are able to subsidize businesses that are going to have some future relevance or future footing. For that, they need to initially reduce not only do they have to have money, but also they need to reduce the tax rates that are imposed on these businesses, because realize that different countries have different scenarios. England and Germany and France have had multiple years of startups coming up and businesses on the cloud coming up. As opposed to that, Eastern European countries are still relatively coming up in this scenario or coming up in this avenue, because of which they need to have lower tax rates so that the coming up businesses in these countries have more money to expand and have more money to scale. It is only then that these companies scale and expand are they able to hire more people. But that's the only scenario where these smaller countries have more soft power internationally, when these companies expand and when these companies go abroad. We feel like for that, for the interim period, or at least for the period that might be very subjective to all countries should have the leeway of reducing tax rates or at least altering tax rates on the basis of their own local requirements. It is then that the principle of like a country having autonomy on its own policy and economic standards becomes extremely important. As my LO completely tells you, the elected government is the one that is most proximate to people and most proximate to the demands and requirements of people. It is then extremely important that this government has capacity to alter laws and a capacity to alter like tax regulations on the basis of the utmost requirements of its own people. You take away that autonomy and agency on side government. Then what is the additional advantage of this? We feel like once these countries have more money, they not only have more leverage in like blocks, but they also have more lobbying power in blocks. We feel like currently most countries, since they do not have enough money, have to concede in a lot of like agreements, but also on a lot of conditions in their bilateral relations with countries, but also within the EU bloc. We feel like then not only are these countries not able to argue to the best extent the prices of their exports or also other policies in bilateral relations, but also they have to make concessions actively. Once you have more money, you have more alternatives because more countries are willing to deal with you. But before that, closing. All right, opening.
Yeah, so what I think top half misses is that a lot of important investment is about inter-EU investment, not about other blocs investing into the EU. Can you be the first person on top half to investigate this?
Yeah, we feel like every country anyway has incentive of like opening up their markets to more and more companies coming in. We feel like countries are not restrictive like that, because once you can maximize the potential of your own country, we feel like you would want to open up your markets to international like players and actors. So it's unlikely that these countries are only restricted to like EU companies or companies within the EU, because we feel like if tax regulation, because we feel like most companies, if they're sprouting up within the EU, would have incentives of like establishing infrastructure and establishing operations within their own country, and because probably it's more proximate. We feel like then it's likely that operations would be like investments would take place from international actors. Then why are we much better? Not only do we help in reducing divide between these countries, but also we provide more autonomy and control for these countries on their own economic policies, because of which opening opposition.
I'd like to thank Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech.
Because firstly, this is a this house supports debate, not a this house would. So when governments say that it's true, doesn't mean it's true. They need to prove it, and they didn't. Secondly, like it doesn't make any logical sense. Presumably, even if like in the just most like, I don't know, just like pure like logical vacuum, no analysis outside, rationally it would just be somewhere in the middle of these. So there would be winners and there would be losers. I'm going to show why it's likely actually to skew towards it's going to be lower than it is higher. So there'd be more countries that would have to decrease corporation tax, and why that's significant. But also why the race to the bottom stuff that OG talks about, we can just flip, because the way that race to the bottom now happens is actually actively far worse for workers. And the interstate competition becomes really, really harmful. So why is it likely to be relatively low? The way that this is likely to happen in like the process that the EU decides anything is, you know, the council and the parliament. So it's the council that has to be close to unanimity, the parliament it has to be a majority. there is more of the smaller states in the council, so you need the interest of the smaller ones, noting that quite a few of the smaller ones have, like, their USP to the world is they have very, very low corporation tax. But also there's just like more in Europe of poorer countries than like the larger economies that have an interest in having comparatively lower than France and Germany in terms of corporation tax, because they want to be competitive relative to France and Germany, who can afford to do that for the reasons that they answered in the POI. What that means then is these countries have an incentive to not have to raise these so that people think, oh, all being equal, I'll just move to Germany. Secondly, the tax havens need some assurance because they are also members of the EU. And if you do this in a way that is really, really shit for them and corporation tax goes up massively and there's a huge amount of capital flight, this literally would just look like a back-breaking recession. We've already seen from the way that like the EU, like, you know, has dealt with Ireland historically, they have it like, they will be, you know, not willing to completely throw a country under the bus to change this. So they will get to, like, you know, change it to them, like making it relatively palatable for countries to still stay here. Thirdly, and again, OG already conceded this, corporate lobbying. There is things like transnational companies that do have a very strong relationship with the infrastructure of the EU that have a huge incentive for this not to be too high. And I know that they can say, oh yeah, the EU is a very, very large bloc, and that therefore means that they will be able to have like influencing power over everyone else. There are other mechanisms that TNCs can do this. Like, I know they still have to trade in the EU, but this looks like things like we will move some of our, or much of our manufacturing out of Europe if you do this. Like, there are other ways that they will basically push back. They have a huge amount of influence. They will still be able to weaponize that influence. So relatively, I think that means then, at the very least, there is quite a lot of countries that they will then have to reduce the corporation rate, and they will actually decrease the amount of corporation tax that they get in. What does that actually mean? So firstly, we accepted that in countries like France and Germany, the larger economies, the like most important economies to the functioning of the EU, and also more broadly, the global economy, a huge amount of things like tax literally will just, you know, decrease. That means that there is less money in taxes. That means that, like, most typically when this happens is you have to literally just reduce public spending for people. That means then people actively get poorer. A very obvious act of harm. What's more, this then decreases support of the EU because people are going to be really, really annoyed that the EU has done this and this has massively hurt them. I think that means that you're far less able to get things on corporation across the EU as a whole. Like, I think that's actively really, really damaging. Noting also that the countries that have high corporation tax tend to be the countries that have a large social welfare system because you need to fund it by this. That means more dependence on the state at the point at which you actively harm those people. That's just massively pissing people off, massively hurting the most vulnerable in a large amount of places in these states. I think, yeah, also, you can't ever do, I'll take the OGPOI in a second. You can't ever do development on things like, for example, if your economy has a massive boom in something like a new burgeoning market like AI or something, and there is a huge amount of corporations coming in, the way that you redistribute the wealth there is by increasing your corporation tax. If you can never do that, and it's always low, you're never able to redistribute the wealth to people from this. I think that's obviously, again, a massive harm that no country is able to do as much redistribution as effectively. I'll take the OGPOI.
Slovakia gets FDI for car assembly because it's
I can't hear you.
Slovakia gets FDI for car assembly because it's a Central European skilled country near Germany and Poland. Greece has tourism. Countries like Estonia made shrewd investments in tech from their EU subsidies. Why do you guys assume tax policy is the only way to secure investment, or is even a tipping point?
Yeah, I agree it's not the only way. I'm actually going to go on to that in a second. What I do think is it's a significant way for countries to secure investment, but more directly, tax and getting money into tax is the most direct way that you get money into the poorest and most vulnerable people in an economy. So what actually changes then in terms of, okay, everything is equal in terms of corporation tax? We get the idea from government. It will be really, really hard for companies to move because they have workers in one area and they're like physically developed there. Firstly, large companies can move because the actual physical cost of basing a corporation in a country isn't moving all of your manufacturing. It's literally just moving where legally your tax designated headquarters is. You just set up a building there, you fill in some forms, it's not expensive. Secondly, you're in the EU. All of the fucking workers can move around. Even if there isn't a significant change, like you can literally just take people with you, or you can just hire other people. I don't think there's a significant change. Functionally, it works as one economic block. It's really, really easy to shift to other places. What is then the change then if you can't change in terms of corporate tax? There are other things that are not regulated by the EU, like your regulations with trade unions. There are other things like your regulations in terms of like actually doing things like workers' rights, actual amount of healthcare. And even if some of them are regulated by the EU, there is a huge incentive for countries to just be like, well, we won't enforce the EU rules as hard because they won't attract this investment. Like they will just, like we can literally see countries like Poland and Hungary are very, very happy to skirt any and get like actual like EU rules and basically have got off free from it because they have other support within the bloc. I think it's really, really likely that countries are either trying to keep, because they know that there is a significant risk now at the point at which it's equalized, that you will just be moving to Germany. So they now have to offer companies extra things. So then there is a significant comparative harm if you need to then change things like, okay, yeah, we will make it harder for trade unions to, like, I don't know, try and like get things like, you know, increased pay, to like actually organize against you. We'll make it easier to break strikes. We'll make it easier to, like, you know, turn a blind eye to workers' regulations. I think that immediately becomes a significant harm because there is a huge amount of desperation here. Yeah, I think like the weighing for this is just very, very simply like the panic, like stability and the status quo in the EU right now is relatively fine. Things are going not that badly. Like there is, like Ireland is doing completely fine, like developmentally. All of the tax havens that they're saying are absolutely awful places to live, have like the highest education, development, etc. The countries that are doing development, that are actually trying to attract investment or have systems working, are going fine. The change here is that once you fuck this up, once you try and equalize this, there's panic across the board. People that want to help people can't help people. Investment doesn't work as well. I think this becomes basically disastrous, clearly opposed.
I'd like to thank the member of opposition for that fine speech. Government Whip, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. First, I want to deal with closing opposition. So closing opposition basically tell you two things. Firstly, these taxes are likely going to be very low, ergo opening government cannot tap in their impacts of having more money for the government and stuff like this. I want to pause a couple of things. Number one, they are, however low they are likely going to be bigger than what tax havens have today. It is very unlikely that you are going to have like 9% taxes across the entire European Union. So what probably is likely going to happen is that you are going to, countries like France and Germany will decrease their taxes, but tax havens and like Eastern Europe and stuff like this are going to have to increase them to some extent. We are fine with Germany and France losing some profit from taxing companies, because problem there is not not enough of capital in these banks, but like not the allocation of capital and stuff like this. But I want to give some more challenges why this is not going to be, why all of their mechanisms, why this is going to be very low, don't work. Because what they say essentially is that like, you are going to, these countries are not going to like this, they are going to be against this and stuff like this. Multiple responses to this. Number one, these countries themselves, and this is the most important response, they don't want race to the bottom. They want to be able to capitalize off of taxes off of these companies, but they know in Bulgaria, if they increase taxes, their companies, but they know that some companies may go to Croatia, so they just want to like avoid race to the bottom and stuff like this. It is in their incentive not to do this. But secondarily, Robbie explains to you why this is going to be gradual and why this is going to be a gradual transition, and why you are likely going to give some kind of concessions to the Poland and like Bulgaria and all these sorts of countries that may want to fuck with you and stuff like this. And this mechanism works because we were able to make them do all the things, like for example, like sanctions on Russia and all these sorts of things that we wanted them, because these countries benefit from being European Union more than vice versa. These countries need European Union funds for like infrastructure and all these sorts of things. When we cut them funds, when we threaten them with things like that, then they, listen to us and stuff like this. And then they say, there is probably going to be corporate lobby. EU bodies are not susceptible to corporate lobby and stuff like this. Why is this so? Number one, politicians tend to care more about voters than about lobbies, because lobbies are just funding your pre-election campaign. Voters are the ones who are actually putting you in the power, so voters have more power. But secondly, we can just see empirically that European Union has been cracking down on like environment, regulations, mismatch, and all these sorts of things. They have been cracking down on companies. Like most of the, lawsuits in the court of the EU has been against the environment and stuff like this. They are not so susceptible to corporate lobby. And also this is something that was just like one liner, like it shouldn't be really credited and stuff like this. Okay. The second thing, but basically what you get on our side of the house is that like poor countries are able to like tax more and get more money. That is something that is certainly happening. Secondly, they say, it is not like, the capital flight is likely to happen because it's just headquarters, so you can remove it. First major response. Then they are not getting any impacts. If we are just talking about headquarters, then all of the impacts that opening opposition is talking about, such as like having workers, having FDI, having capital there, if it's just headquarters, then you are not able to get all of these benefits. So we don't give a fuck about just headquarters being there. Then it means that you are unable to like access any kind of benefits. You have zero impact. But secondly, even removing just headquarters is something that's incredibly logistically inconvenient, and it's not going to happen. So firstly, the thing is that companies in these countries are able to afford themselves higher taxes because they are making massive amounts of profit, like insane amounts of profit, which means that they are able to, how you say, even if it like raises from 9% to 20%, they are still able to turn profit from these countries and stuff like this. But why is it logistically inconvenient and costly to remove even the headquarters? Firstly, because of the costs and the logistics. Like you can literally, like you have invested money into this and now you have to allocate it differently. Secondly, your employers who have trained people who live there to work there and stuff like this, and this is all wasted capital, and now you have to like find different people who may fuck up and all these sorts of things. Thirdly, it is incredibly like there is a lot of like bureaucracy and legal regulations and stuff like this. This may take a lot of time. Fourthly, you have to pause business activities when you are shutting down headquarters and waiting to establish it somewhere else. It can take years, and you have to pause business activities because you are unable to go through the regulation and paperwork and all the things that they are doing in headquarters. Opening opposition, they just say you are not going to get FDI and all these sorts of things to small countries and stuff like this. Firstly, and I want to pause it, even if I want to posit that these countries have still comparative advantage that is going to incentivize capital going to them. Robbie tells you this. Firstly, because cost of living is cheap in Croatia, you can literally pay people 700 euros a month and they are going to be just fine. So you have like, how you say, cheap labor and all these sorts of things, which allows you to turn profit. Secondly, you want to expand your company into untapped market. You want to like increase your consumer base in order to make profit and all these sorts of things. And thirdly, they may have some kind of like niches and stuff like this, which means that you are still going to want to go to these countries. And you also don't have a lot of competition there, which means that you are able to, how you say, get money from people and all these kinds of things. But basically what they say is that but the second thing that I also want to talk about is that this was useful when we were attracting companies, like when this policy was first introduced, like to lower, how you say, but right now we don't really need it anymore. I don't really need it anymore because capital flight is unlikely to happen. I want to talk more about this, but before that, POI from all.
The comparative on opposition isn't low tax rates across all countries. It's about flexibility and giving countries autonomy to decide for themselves and their domestic conditions. Why is that
So
bad?
their only rationale is I have to, how you say, tax little so they don't go to Croatia. And this is bad because they're losing money. Okay, and I would posit that you are getting more FDI on our side of the house because there is more predictability. Like there is, when you are investing in a country, you are scared of the political turmoil and changes in the economic policy and stuff like this, which can hinder your profit. You're scared of that as the investor, but once you know, okay, this is a fixed tax rate that is not going to change with the political body and the new politician, I am now more likely to invest in this country and stuff like this. And capital flight is also hard to do because like you already have like utilities, workforce and infrastructure developed there. You also have established customer base there. You also have like a lot of networking with the suppliers and contractors and all these sorts of things. And process of reallocation is just expensive and useless. Okay, now on to the opening government. Firstly, I think the problem is that like we explained to you why. Firstly, small tax companies are going to have like companies are still going to have interest in the how you say Eastern Europe, and secondly, that capital flight is unlikely to happen, which is able for us to unlock their impact about being able to get money from taxes and then vote for us.
I'd like to thank the government whip for that fine speech. Opposition whip, whenever you're ready.
Perfect. Am I audible?
You froze for a bit.
Yeah, your internet cut just for a second there.
Yeah, it's being a bit weird. So like if people don't need their cameras on, then potentially turning them off might help it just stay.
Great. Well, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I think there's a few important things to highlight that come out of closing opposition. First of all, I want to re-emphasize this idea of a race to the bottom, because I think the thing about this race to the bottom is it is not the same race to the bottom that opening government are telling us we will have. What we tell you is that we will not get corporate tax constantly being cut on our side for the main reason that this aid just doesn't happen in the status quo. We don't see France and Germany with extremely low corporation taxes because there's loads of other factors that go into this. There's all of the benefits that we have all of government bench talking about, the idea of like the amount you pay your workers, all of these different things, the resources within this country. There's not currently a race to the bottom, and I don't think there's sufficient analysis against our pushback to prove why there is still going to be one in terms of this way of corporate tax. What we tell you there will be, because you now have standard corporate tax, it's no longer something you can compete on. It's no longer a USP for you. So what places like that previously had low corporate tax have to do is they have to find some other way to sell to themselves. Because in reality, France, Germany, all of these places are probably going to be fine, regardless of which side we're on. They're probably still going to have business because they are kind of like epicenters of the EU. Places like Bulgaria, who are poorer countries within the EU, who are more developed in terms of their like sophisticated industry that is happening, will have to find other ways to sell themselves. They will have to, like, for example, reduce the cost of manufacturing by reducing the cost of labor. This looks like reducing the minimum wage, not cracking down on companies if they're not paying people for overtime and everything like this. It looks like just various different small laws, breaking up trade unions to avoid strikes so that there's going to be more stable business within that country. This has a massive impact on people within the EU, people who are working for these companies, because this does not happen in the op side of the world. You do not have this same race to the bottom on our side because you are able to still compete on corporation tax. But what you do have now on the gov side is a direct harm to workers who are currently working for these companies that specifically happens when we implement this change. I think we get some pushback from closing government against this idea, just in terms of this idea of what it looks like that's going to be gradual, that the EU cracks down. First of all, I just want to note that the EU is never an 100% effective actor, that there's going to be lots of things that slip through the net, and probably because they're so busy in forcing this corporate tax, that takes up a certain amount of resources from the EU. So it's unlikely the EU is all these things. Also, countries have the incentive to hide it. How does the EU find out all of these kind of things happen? I don't think they provide the sufficient analysis to specifically tell me why this race to the bottom does not happen. This is a massive harm that comes on our side. Let's do some quick bench weighing, because I think this is important here. I just think the issue with opening opposition is, first of all, most of closing government's rebuttal is fair enough. Opening opposition don't prove a lot of the things they say. But secondly, why do I care about anything they say? Why do I care about countries having flexibility to set their own tax rates? Why do I care about like the benefits to small businesses versus the supposed benefits that we get from government? I think closing opposition specifically tell you, A, why you should care, and B, what the comparative is. You're willing to trade off some like tax benefits, like some increased tax in places like Ireland, places like Luxembourg, in favor of continuously just still having that tax paid. No, Joseph's framing is key here, because it isn't likely to be super high. Opening government kind of broadly assert this, and it's not pushed back against, apart from in Joseph's speech. But for all the reasons, even if you don't buy that, I just still think that you're going to struggle more so to get companies to pay it across every single EU state, which means that at the best, the amount of tax being paid is probably like roughly equal. What you do lose though is the level of flexibility, and Joseph tells you why you should care about this. And note this clashes with opening government, because they give this main case as well about the benefit of stability, the EU helping in economic shocks. Individual EU countries experience economic shocks very differently. A shortage in wood is going to affect Ireland differently than it's going to affect Bulgaria, differently than it's going to affect Croatia, depending on the industries that are currently operating within that, which means that the EU, even if it does have a standard tax across all of the countries, even if it does have this slight increase in knowledge, probably still isn't going to be able to do it in a way that's going to benefit everyone. It's probably just easier if you give countries the ability to differ their own corporate tax, because then they can respond more quickly to these shocks that happen within their own country, because there is these individual shocks. There is differences in supply chains that are used more so by some countries than others. We give you the one flexibility that countries can have to benefit this. Joseph tells you the ways in which this benefits people within the country. The benefits of having greater tax just means having greater money within the country and everything like this. And also it's money that goes up in times when you're likely to need it as well. You're likely to be able to redistribute it in a way that is better for your individual company. Opening opposition touch on this. They never tell us why we should care. They never impact it. They never weigh it, which means that we are able to take this point over them. First, I'll take, does opening government have a point? Closing government?
Sure. So we don't care about people in Germany having less money. The important thing is we have cheap labor force in Eastern Europe. We have untapped markets. Businesses will still stay, but we will tax them more. This is a unique contribution. CG is first.
Yeah, no, I just don't think I said that we care like most about Germany. What I'm talking about is the people within these same countries that you talk about who just because they have cheap cost of living does not mean that they're still like their workers' rights and everything like that are still not going to go down. Engage with all of our material on this idea of race to the bottom. CG never specifically actually really engage with this. One of their main points is that you're not going to have capital flight. I think, first of all, Joseph tells you a lot of the reasons why this isn't necessarily true, and I don't think it's rebuilt sufficiently by closing government. But let's take them at their absolute best, and note this applies to all of government side. Let's take it at the absolute best and say that, okay, there is some benefits to this. I think we still give you reasons as to why it's going to be harmful to people on the ground in these various countries. I think when government fail to actually give you like concrete impacts and tell you why you should care about the ways in which these things affect different countries, we are the ones who are able to do that. Note that we are specifically benefiting various workers within these countries. We're benefiting people on the ground. We're allowing greater tax to go into things like healthcare, people to be able to gain more control over their working rights, countries being able to respond to their own specific economic shocks and to avoid this race to the bottom that's ultimately just going to harm workers. And the ways in which these race to the bottom harm workers normally starts at the bottom, the people who have minimal rights already. This is a massive impact that is not given by anyone else. Joseph sufficiently reframes the debate. I give sufficient rebuttal to prove why the other teams within this debate are out. CO goes through.
Great. I'd like to thank the member of opposition